Welcome to Forgotten Worlds for Sleep, a place where the forgotten past breathes again, where empires rise and fall beneath the silent moon, and every echo of history becomes a lullaby. Here, the voices of kings, travelers, and dreamers whisper through the centuries, not to awaken you, but to let you drift deeper. Each night, we open another door, to a moment lost in time, a temple in the desert, a ship on the edge of the world, a candle flickering in a palace long since turned to dust. Close your eyes. Let the noise fade. You are entering the forgotten world, where even history sleeps. The night was cold, and the wind carried the scent of dust and ash across the farmlands of Anhui. In a small village of mud walls and broken fields, a child was born beneath the glow of a dying fire. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang. To his parents, he was a fragile hope in a world already collapsing. The Yuan Dynasty still ruled China then, but its power was rotting from within. Taxes grew heavier each year, while floods from the Yellow River washed away entire harvests. Villages that once sang with the hum of spring planting had fallen silent, the fields now cracked and empty. And when locusts came, black clouds that blotted out the sun, there was nothing left to lose. Zhu's father worked the soil until his hands bled. His mother boiled roots and bark to feed their children. But famine does not bargain. It crept into their home like smoke, quiet and cruel. When the last rain was gone, neighbors fled in search of food, or simply lay down and did not rise again. Zhu was barely a boy when he saw death for the first time. Not on the battlefield, but in the corner of his own home. One by one, his family faded. First his brothers, then his mother. By the time his father died, Zhu was 16, alone, barefoot, and hungry. He wandered through villages where temples had turned into shelters for the starving. Dogs fought over corpses in the streets. The world, it seemed, had forgotten mercy. Yet even in this darkness, something in him refused to die. At night, he slept beneath temple eaves and whispered to himself that the world could not always be this cruel. He dreamed of full bowls of rice, of clean water, of safety. Dreams, small, fragile, but defiant, became his only possessions. When famine struck hardest, he sought refuge in a Buddhist monastery. The monks offered him rice in exchange for labor, and for a time, he survived by sweeping floors and chanting prayers he did not understand. There was peace in the rhythm of it, the slow ring of bells, the scent of incense curling through the halls. But peace, too, proved temporary. As hunger deepened across the province, even the temple's granaries emptied. One by one, the monks were forced to turn away the young novices they could no longer feed. Zhu Yuanzhang, once again, was cast out into the wind. Imagine walking a road that never ends, with nothing but dust beneath your feet. Can you hear the silence of an empty field? Can you feel the hunger that gnaws not only at the body, but at the soul? That was Zhu's world, endless, gray, unforgiving. And yet, each dawn, he kept walking. Some say he begged not only for food, but for stories. He listened to peasants whisper about justice, about a red-robed army rising in the south that promised deliverance from the Mongol lords. To him, these were not just rumors. They were the first taste of hope he had known in years. When night fell, he looked up at the stars, wondering if heaven still watched over people like him. In the distance, fires burned on the horizon, villages rising in rebellion, banners painted crimson in the dust. He did not yet know that he would one day lead such armies, that his name would echo through centuries. He only knew the ache of survival and the faint, stubborn belief that suffering could not be the only story written for him. So he walked, through famine, through plague, through the ruins of the Yuan world. Every step a quiet act of defiance, every breath a small victory. History remembers emperors for their palaces and conquests, but it began here, in hunger and dust, with a boy who refused to stop moving. And perhaps, as you drift toward sleep, you might ask yourself, what would you hold on to when the world around you falls apart? Would you still believe that tomorrow could be kinder? He did. and that belief would one day build an empire. The boy who had once been a farmer's son now walked the earth like a shadow. Dust clung to his clothes. Hunger hollowed his eyes. The fields of Anhui were dead, and the world had turned against its own children. Yet, in the midst of despair, one door still opened, the door of a monastery. Zhu Yuanzhang arrived at the gates of Huangjue Temple, trembling from exhaustion. The monks saw not a future emperor, but a starving boy in torn rags. They gave him a bowl of rice, a corner of floor to sleep on, and a name among their ranks. Novice Zhu. For the first time in years, he ate until his stomach no longer ached. He learned to bow before the Buddha, to chant sutras that rolled like soft rain over the heart. The rhythm of temple life was gentle, steady, dawn bells, evening gongs, the slow sweep of brooms across stone. He found peace there, not because the world had changed, but because within those walls he could breathe. Days turned into months. Zhu worked in the kitchen, tended the gardens, copied scriptures by candlelight. The abbot noticed his focus, the way his hands did not tremble even after long hours of labor. Perhaps hardship had already taught him discipline long before prayer ever could. At night, he listened to the wind move through the pines and thought of his family, the ones he had lost to hunger. He prayed not for wealth, not even for safety, but for the strength to endure. Still, even temples are not safe from famine. When the Yellow River flooded again, the granaries of Huangjue ran empty. The monks began to argue in whispers, counting sacks of grain that no longer existed. One morning, the abbot gathered the young novices. His voice was kind but heavy. "There is no more food," he said. "You must go into the world and beg. May compassion guide you." Zhu bowed deeply, understanding what that meant. He tied a piece of cloth around his feet, picked up a wooden bowl, and stepped beyond the temple gates. The world that met him was crueler than before. Roads were lined with corpses, and the sky seemed to weep dust instead of rain. He begged from door to door, whispering prayers for those who turned him away. Sometimes he shared what little he was given with others weaker than himself. Children, the elderly, the sick. Even as hunger gnawed at his stomach, something in him had begun to change. Suffering no longer frightened him. It shaped him. One night, he found shelter in the ruins of an old shrine. The moonlight poured through the broken roof, illuminating carvings of dragons and clouds. He stared at them and wondered what kind of man could ever rise high enough to carve his name into stone. He did not yet know that his own name would one day be carved deeper than any before him. He was still only a beggar, but a beggar who dreamed. As he wandered from village to village, stories drifted on the wind. Rumors of rebellion, of the Red Turbans who fought against the Mongols. Farmers whispered that the time of the Yuan was ending, that heaven itself had turned away from the foreign rulers. Each rumor lit a spark in him. Could it be that even peasants might change the fate of the world? Zhu carried these whispers with him like prayers. When he was turned away from another door, when his bowl came back empty, he would whisper to himself, "Endure, endure and wait." Hope for him was not loud. It was quiet, like a candle flame in the wind, small, trembling, but alive. And you, if you were walking beside him on those silent roads, would you have given up? Would you have traded your hope for safety, your dreams for a full stomach? Or would you, too, keep walking, trusting that even in the ashes of despair, something new could still be born? Zhu Yuanzhang walked on. He did not yet know where the road would lead, only that forward was the only direction left. He passed through towns where war drums echoed in the distance, where banners of rebellion fluttered against the dusk. He saw soldiers, ragged and fierce, carrying the same hunger in their eyes that he saw in his own reflection. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "You have seen the worst the world can give. Now learn to fight for something better." When he slept that night, his dreams were different, no longer of monks or empty bowls, but of rising banners, of people standing together, of a sky not ruled by fear. The boy who had once begged for food had begun to hunger for justice. and as the night deepened, the wind over Anhui carried the faint sound of drums, the call of destiny still far away, but growing louder with every step he took. By the time Zhu Yuanzhang reached his 24th year, the world had become a furnace. Villages burned like lanterns in the night. Across the plains of central China, armies of peasants carried red banners and called themselves the Red Turbans. They said heaven had turned its face from the Mongol rulers. They said a new age was coming, one born not from silk and palaces, but from hunger and dust. Zhu had wandered long enough to know the truth in those whispers. He had seen the bodies of children starved by taxes, fields salted by soldiers, and monasteries stripped of grain. So when a rebel recruiter crossed his path, he did not hesitate. He traded his begging bowl for a spear and joined the rising storm. At first, he was only another nameless foot soldier, one more soul swallowed by the tide. But Zhu was not like the others. He had learned discipline in the monastery, endurance on the road, and humility in the face of death. When the officers shouted, he obeyed without complaint. When the others fought for plunder, he fought for order. Soon, his commanders noticed the quiet man who kept his word, who shared his food with the hungry and never stole from the villagers they passed. In chaos, integrity shines the brightest. His first battle came near the banks of the Yangtze, where reeds swayed like ghosts and smoke covered the sun. The enemy was another rebel band, not Mongols, but men like themselves, hungry and desperate, fighting under a different banner. Zhu's commander fell early, and confusion swept the ranks. But Zhu rallied his comrades, shouting above the clash of steel, guiding them back to formation. When the battle ended, the Red Turbans held the field. It was said that the quiet peasant had led a charge that turned defeat into victory. He was promoted to officer that same night. Still, war was not glory to him. He saw too many villages destroyed by the very men who claimed to free them. He forbade looting under his command, punished cruelty, and protected farmers whenever he could. It was a small mercy, but word spread quickly. Soon, villagers began to open their doors again, to feed his soldiers, to whisper prayers for the man who brought order where others brought ruin. Hope travels fast in a broken land. Do you ever wonder how courage begins? Is it in great speeches, or in small acts done quietly, when no one is watching? For Zhu, courage was not the roar of battle, but the moment he looked into the eyes of frightened peasants and swore he would not become like the monsters he fought. He knew that power could corrupt, that victory could twist the heart. So each night, he prayed not for triumph, but for restraint. In 1353, fate bound him to a powerful ally. A senior rebel leader, Zhengde, noticed Zhu's discipline and loyalty. He gave him his daughter in marriage, Ma, a woman of calm intelligence and quiet strength. She became his anchor, the single constant amid a world of blood and fire. While other commanders indulged in excess, Zhu listened to her counsel and remembered the hunger of his youth. Together, they dreamed of a China healed, not just conquered. Under his leadership, order began to return to the territories he controlled. Granaries reopened, taxes were kept fair, and for the first time in years, farmers plowed without fear. Scholars fleeing chaos found refuge in his camps, teaching him the ways of governance and history. Among them was a strategist named Liu Bowen, whose wisdom would guide him for the rest of his life. From these beginnings, ragged and fragile, an empire was already taking shape. As the months passed, Zhu's reputation grew. Other warlords, reckless and cruel, began to fear him. He commanded loyalty not through fear, but through justice, a rare power in those days. When Zhengde died suddenly, many expected his faction to collapse. Instead, Zhu took the reins with calm authority. He buried his father-in-law with honor, gathered the scattered soldiers, and declared that their struggle would continue, not for vengeance, but for peace. His men followed without hesitation. Some nights, he stood by the campfires and looked toward the distant north. There, beyond the horizon, lay the cities of the Mongols, their towers gleaming under foreign banners. He whispered to himself, "Someday, heaven will return to its own people." The words were quiet, almost like a prayer, but the wind carried them far. And you, listening now, have you ever felt that the world has forgotten fairness? That those who suffer most are the ones who least deserve it? Zhu Yuanzhang felt that too, but instead of surrendering, he turned his suffering into resolve. He believed that the same heaven that witnessed his hunger also watched his rise. He did not yet wear the robes of an emperor, but the heart of one had already begun to beat within him. As dawn rose over the rebel camp, drums echoed through the valley. Red banners rippled against a sky the color of ash, and beneath them stood a man who had once begged for rice, now commanding armies, still humble, still hungry, not for food this time, but for justice. The smoke of rebellion drifted across the Yangtze River like a ghost that refused to fade. Zhu Yuanzhang, now a commander in his own right, rode through the mist, the red banners of his army snapping in the wind. He was no longer the boy who begged for rice, nor merely a monk with a bowl. He had become something else, a man learning how to lead, how to carry the weight of thousands of lives. His army was not large, but it was disciplined. He forbade looting, demanded fairness in every village they passed, and punished even officers who abused the weak. Soldiers under his command knew they would be fed, paid, and treated with respect. In an age when most warlords ruled through fear, Zhu ruled through order. It was a quiet revolution, one born not of politics, but of moral will. Each morning, he walked among the tents before dawn. He spoke to the soldiers not as a distant general, but as one of them. He asked about their families, their wounds, their hunger. Many could hardly believe a commander would care. Yet Zhu understood them, because he had been one of them. He knew what it was to starve, to freeze, to hope for a leader who would not abandon them when the battle ended. Rumors of his fairness spread faster than any victory. Villages opened their gates when they saw his banners. Farmers brought rice and grain, not because they were forced, but because they trusted him. His men pay for what they take. They whispered, "He is not like the others." Still, war was never far. In the plains around the Yangtze, rival rebel factions turned against each other. Men who once called themselves brothers now fought for power. Zhu refused to join their reckless campaigns. He told his advisors, "Those who destroy the land cannot hope to rule it." He chose patience over glory, building fortifications, restoring canals, and feeding the people under his protection. In time, his territories became islands of stability in a sea of chaos. Do you ever wonder what makes people follow one man and not another? Is it fear or faith? Perhaps it's the way he looks at you and makes you believe that tomorrow might be worth waiting for. That was what Zhu gave his followers, not promises of riches, but a sense of direction. He surrounded himself with men of thought as well as men of action. Lu Bowen, the scholar strategist, became his closest advisor, a man who could read the movements of heaven as clearly as the lines on his palm. From Lu, Zhu learned not only war, but governance, how to tax without cruelty, how to command without arrogance, how to plan beyond the next battle. At night, the two would speak beneath the lanterns, their words drifting between philosophy and survival. In 1356, Zhu led his forces to the gates of Nanjing, a city that lay broken after years of conflict. The walls were cracked, the markets empty. But to Zhu, it was not a ruin, it was a seed. He entered without destruction, promising the citizens protection. Under his rule, Nanjing began to breathe again. Markets reopened. Temples rang their bells once more. Within months, the city became the beating heart of his growing domain. He began to dream not just of victory, but of rebuilding. He ordered granaries to be filled, canals repaired, and farmland restored. He told his officers, "An empire is not built by conquest. It is built by feeding its people." They listened, though few truly understood the depth of his vision. He had seen too much hunger to ever forget it. And you, if you held power after years of suffering, Would you still remember what it felt like to be powerless? Would you still share your bread with those who once walked beside you in the dust? Zhu did, at least for now. But power tests even the purest hearts. As his banners spread across the south, new challenges emerged. Other warlords saw him not as a savior, but as a rival. They whispered in fear that the beggar monk might soon claim heaven's mandate for himself. They plotted, schemed, and waited for their chance to strike. Zhu, meanwhile, wrote letters to the scholars and elders of the provinces, inviting them to join him in rebuilding the nation. China, he wrote, must belong once again to those who till its soil. His message was simple, but it struck like lightning in the hearts of the weary. Farmers joined him. Blacksmiths, artisans, monks, all came to serve the man who had once walked among them. At sunset, Zhu often stood upon the walls of Nanjing, watching the river gleam like molten bronze. He would think of his parents, of the famine that had taken them, and of the thousands who still suffered. "Let no man know the hunger I have known," he would whisper. The wind carried his vow across the water. History would later call this the beginning of the Ming. But to Zhu Yuanzhang, it was still only a promise, a fragile hope shaped from hunger, courage, and the will to keep moving forward. Nanjing breathed again. Its walls, once blackened by fire, now echoed with the laughter of merchants and the ring of temple bells. The markets reopened, the canals shimmered beneath morning light, and farmers began to return to the land. In the heart of this fragile peace stood Zhu Yuanzhang, no longer a wanderer, but a ruler in the making. And beside him stood the one who steadied his heart, Lady Ma, his wife, his companion in hardship, and the quiet soul who reminded him why he fought. They had met years before, when Zhu was still a commander under Guozixing. She was Guo's adopted daughter, intelligent, calm, unafraid to speak her mind. When her father saw the discipline in Zhu's eyes, he gave her hand in marriage, saying, "You will need someone who knows how to keep your heart human." And so, amid the thunder of rebellion, their union was sealed not by silk and ceremony, but by trust and shared hunger. Life with Ma was simple, even as Zhu's power grew. She mended his robes when they tore, reminded him to eat when he forgot, and sat beside him when the weight of command pressed too heavily upon his shoulders. She did not wear jewels or paint her face. Her strength was quieter than that. When soldiers brought spoils from battle, she gave them away to the poor, saying softly, "If we forget hunger, we will lose heaven's favor." At night, when Nanjing slept, Zhu would walk with her along the city walls. The moon cast their shadows long against the stones. He spoke of the future, of peace, of justice, of an empire built not on fear but fairness. And she would listen, smiling faintly, before saying, "Then you must remember what it felt like to have nothing. Only those who remember can rule with mercy." He never forgot those words. Even when war returned, even when the world demanded cruelty, her voice lingered like a lamp in the dark. Do you believe that love can survive through chaos? That tenderness can live within the heart of a man made for war? Zhu Yuanzhang did. To him, Ma was not a weakness, but an anchor, the one thread that kept him tied to humanity. War, however, did not sleep. The Mongols still ruled in the north, and rival warlords threatened from the east and west. In 1360, Qin Yuliang, a powerful commander who styled himself King of Han, gathered massive armies along the Yangtze. He claimed the mandate of heaven for himself and sent envoys to demand Zhu's submission. Zhu met them in his audience hall, a modest chamber, the walls still smelling of fresh plaster. He listened without expression as they read Qin's demands. Then he said quietly, "Tell your master, the people are not cattle to be traded between kings. He may call himself heaven's chosen, but heaven listens to the cries of the hungry, and they call for me." The envoys left pale and silent. That night, Ma found him alone, staring at the map spread before him. She placed her hand on his and whispered, "If you must fight, do not fight for pride. Fight for the people who still believe in you." He nodded. her words sinking deeper than any counsel from his generals. The war that followed was brutal. Battles raged along the river. Camps burned, and the air thickened with ash. Yet Zhu's army held firm, guided by discipline and faith. He forbade plunder, rewarded restraint, and buried the dead of both sides with honor. Even in war, he sought to preserve the dignity of life. Among his soldiers, a saying began to spread: "Our commander's sword cuts only to protect." And from that faith, loyalty grew stronger than fear. His men fought not just because they were ordered to, but because they believed in him. When victory finally came, Zhu wept, not for triumph, but for the countless lives lost to ambition. Ma found him in his tent, his armor streaked with soot and sweat. She wiped his face gently and said, "You cannot save everyone, but you can make their deaths mean something." He looked into her eyes and saw the truth of it. For all the power he was gathering, it was compassion that would define his reign. And you, if you were given the chance to lead, would you still remember kindness? Would you have the strength to care when the world teaches you only to harden? Perhaps that is what true power really is, not the ability to command, but to remain human in the midst of fire. As dawn broke over Nanjing, the river glowed like molten gold. Zhu stood beside Ma on the ramparts, the wind tugging at their robes, and in the distance, the sound of rebuilding began. Hammer against stone, a rhythm of renewal. He whispered, "For the people, always for the people." She smiled and nodded. For now, heaven seemed to listen. The years that followed brought not peace, but turmoil of a different kind. For the Mongols were not the only rulers China had to endure. Even as the Yuan Dynasty weakened in the north, the land beneath heaven tore itself apart. Every province had its own king, every army its own banner, and each of them claimed the same divine right, the mandate of heaven. Zhu Yuanzhang watched this chaos unfold from a stronghold in Nanjing. He had won battles, earned loyalty, and built order where none existed. But now, ambition surrounded him like smoke. Warlords who once fought as allies turned their swords toward one another. The rebellion, born of hunger and hope, had become a contest for power. His greatest rival was Chen Yuliang, the self-proclaimed king of Han. Chen commanded fleets of warships and thousands of soldiers. He was brilliant, ruthless, and charming, the kind of man who could make loyalty seem like an illusion. He accused Zhu of hypocrisy, claiming that the Mengtern general hid his thirst for power behind a mask of virtue. Zhu answered not with words, but with patience. He knew that heaven tested those it intended to raise. He spent months strengthening his rule in the lower Yangtze. Grain was stored in stone granaries, bridges repaired, and canals cleared of silt. He sent envoys to scholars and monks, inviting them to his court. To them, he spoke not of conquest, but of rebuilding. The people, he said, do not dream of kings. They dream of a bowl of rice and a night without fear. And slowly, even scholars who had once fled the capital began to return. The city of Nanjing, once a ruin, now shimmered with purpose. But peace could not last. Chen Yuliang began his march eastward, seizing towns and threatening Nanjing's trade routes. His ambition burned like wildfire, consuming all who opposed him. Many rebel leaders, fearing Chen's wrath, turned against Zhu. Banners that once stood side by side now faced each other across rivers. The Red Turbans, once united against Mongol rule, were tearing themselves apart. Zhu faced a choice: submit, retreat, or fight. He gathered his generals beneath the flicker of lamplight in his war hall. Maps stretched across the table like wounds on the earth. Some urged caution, others demanded immediate attack. Zhu listened in silence. Then he said softly, "If we fight for heaven's mandate, we must deserve it first. A throne built on greed will collapse. A kingdom built on virtue will stand." His generals bowed. They understood. They were not just soldiers now. They were builders of destiny. That spring, Zhu's forces clashed with Chen's along the Yangtze. The air filled with the stench of smoke and iron. Arrows hissed like rain. Zhu commanded from the riverbanks, calm amid the chaos. His ships moved in disciplined formation, while Chen's massive fleet surged like a storm. For days, neither side gained ground. Then, one night, Zhu ordered the fireships. Hundreds of small boats, soaked in oil, set alight, and driven by the wind, crashed into Chen's vessels. Flames consumed the river. The water reflected the inferno like a mirror of heaven's judgment. By dawn, Chen's fleet was shattered. The man who called himself king of Han fled into the darkness. His empire of ambition burned to ash. After the battle, Zhu walked the silent shores. The smell of charred wood and death lingered in the air. He bowed his head and whispered, "Heaven does not bless cruelty." Then he ordered the river cleansed of corpses, and the surviving prisoners fed and released. Even in victory, he refused to forget compassion. Do you think goodness can survive in war? Can a man hold mercy in one hand and a sword in the other? For Zhu Yuanzhang, that was the only way forward. He believed that heaven did not favor the strongest, but the most steadfast, the one who could endure without losing his soul. In the years that followed, his power grew. Other warlords fell or submitted. He captured cities without destroying them, restored fields instead of burning them. And each time he was tempted by pride, he remembered Ma's quiet words, "Do not forget what it means to be hungry." By 1365, the rivers of the south flowed again, trade returned, and the name Zhu Yuanzhang spread across China like a prayer. To some, he was a rebel, to others, a savior, but to the peasants who once fled famine, he was something far simpler, the man who kept his word. At sunset, he stood on the walls of Nanjing, the sky painted in fire and gold. The wind carried the scent of rain and earth. He looked north, toward the Mongol-held lands, and whispered to the coming storm, "The empire will be ours, not for power, but for peace." The fires of war had dimmed for a moment, leaving behind a fragile stillness. Nanjing glowed beneath the summer sun, its walls mended, its canals flowing once more. But Zhu Yuanzhang knew peace was only an illusion. Beyond the calm horizon, other armies gathered. In the north, the Mongols still ruled, and in the west, ambitious generals waited for the right moment to rise. Victory had given him power, but power, he was learning, is the beginning of new dangers. It was during this uneasy calm that a new figure arrived in Nanjing, a scholar dressed in plain robes, carrying nothing but a bundle of old scrolls and a quiet confidence. His name was Lu Bowen. He was known across the land as a man of sharp mind and deep understanding, one who studied both heaven's patterns and the hearts of men. Zhu met him in the audience hall, expecting another court philosopher, but when Lu spoke, his words carried a weight that silenced even the most seasoned generals. "Your Majesty," he said, though Zhu had not yet taken the throne, "the empire you seek to build cannot rest only on victory. It must rest on harmony of heaven, earth, and the people. You have won battles, but the war for their hearts has just begun." Those words struck Zhu deeply. He had long understood hunger, fear, and loyalty, but harmony, that was something different. That night, he asked Lu to stay. They walked together through the gardens of Nanjing, the moonlight silver on the lotus ponds. Lu spoke of laws, taxes, and reforms, but also of the unseen, how rulers must balance compassion with control, and how fortune follows those who act in alignment with heaven's will. Zhu listened in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of leadership. He asked, "If heaven truly grants its mandate, why does it allow so much suffering?" Lu smiled faintly, "Because even heaven tests those who wish to change the world. Suffering is the price of awakening." From that night forward, Lu Bowen became his closest counselor. He advised on everything, from military campaigns to how grain should be stored before the floods. He insisted that records be kept, that taxes be fair, and that officials answer not to wealth, but to merit. He even encouraged Zhu to study history, not to imitate past emperors, but to learn from their failures. The greatest ruler, Lu said, is not the one who conquers most lands, but the one who leaves the least bitterness behind. Do you believe wisdom can save a kingdom? Can a few words of truth change the course of an empire? Perhaps not at once, but they can shape the heart of the man who holds it. And that, in time, changes everything. With Lu's counsel, Zhu began to think beyond survival. He organized schools to educate the sons of farmers and soldiers. He opened granaries in poor harvests and forbade officials from exploiting the weak. When a magistrate was caught extorting villagers, Zhu ordered his removal, not with anger, but with quiet finality. He said, "If I forget where I came from, I will no longer deserve where I stand." Those words spread through the provinces like a sermon. Yet even as his vision grew, doubt still haunted him. He had seen too much treachery to trust easily. Each time a messenger arrived with news of a distant rebellion, his chest tightened. He asked Lu, "How can I build peace when every man around me wants to rule?" Lu replied, "By ruling not through fear, but through order. Fear ends when you are gone. Order endures when you are forgotten." In 1366, he called his generals and advisors to a grand council. Maps of the empire were spread before them, red lines tracing rivers and roads, black marks showing the last Mongol strongholds. The room was silent. Then Zhu rose and said, "The time has come to end this long night. We will march north, not as conquerors, but as deliverers. Let no soldier harm the innocent. Let no house burn without cause. We fight not for power, but for peace." The men bowed deeply. Some whispered prayers. Others clenched their fists with pride. They knew what was coming, the final campaign that would decide the fate of the empire. That night, Zhu stood on the walls of Nanjing once more. The moon hung low, and the wind smelled of rain. Beside him, Lu Bowen watched the river, calm and distant. He said softly, "When this is over, Your Majesty, remember this moment. Before the crown, before the palace, before history begins to carve your name. Remember that all of this began with a man who simply refused to starve." Zhu said nothing. He only looked north, toward the darkness beyond the mountains, and whispered to the wind, "Then let us bring dawn to those who have waited too long in the dark." And so, the march toward destiny began, one step closer to an empire built on endurance, guided by wisdom, and held together by the quiet promise that hope, once awakened, would never die again. The summer of 1363 came heavy with heat and tension. Cicadas cried from the reeds, and the wind carried the scent of smoke from distant fires. Across the waters of Lake Poyang, two great armies waited, one led by Chen Yuliang, the self-proclaimed king of Han, and the other by Zhu Yuanzhang, the monk who had risen from dust and hunger. For months, rumors had whispered that this battle would decide who would hold the mandate of heaven. The lake was vast, a mirror of the sky itself. Its surface glittered beneath the sun like molten glass, and upon it floated thousands of ships, banners snapping, oars glinting, drums echoing across the waves. To the villagers who watched from the shore, it was as if the heavens themselves were preparing for war. Zhu stood on the deck of his flagship at dawn, his armor plain, his expression calm. Around him, his commander spoke of numbers and formations. Chen Yuliang's fleet was larger, his ships taller and heavily fortified, floating fortresses, their decks bristling with archers. But Zhu had something Chen did not: discipline, trust, and the quiet strength of a cause rooted in the hearts of the common people. He turned to his men and said, "We are not fighting for glory. We fight for those who have no voice. Let every arrow we loose serve justice. Let every strike protect the innocent. If heaven is watching, let it see we fight with clean hearts." The soldiers bowed their heads. Some whispered prayers. Others gripped their weapons a little tighter, as if to hold on to those words. Then the drums thundered. The battle began. Cannon fire tore through the still air, and the great ships collided, the sound like thunder rolling across the lake. Flaming arrows streaked through the sky. The water churned red beneath the hulls. Zhu's smaller vessels darted between the enemy's giants like fish among whales, setting fires where they could, striking fast, then vanishing into mist. At dusk, smoke veiled the horizon, a shroud for thousands who had fallen beneath the surface. For 3 days, the battle raged. The heat grew unbearable, the air thick with ash and screams. Zhu refused to rest. He moved from ship to ship, his voice steady, his commands clear. Hold the line. Protect your brothers. Do not yield. Even as arrows grazed his armor, his presence gave courage. Men fought harder because he was there, not as a distant ruler, but as one of them. On the 4th night, Zhu gathered his officers. They were exhausted, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Qin Yuanyang's flagship still dominated the lake, its walls towering, its crew numerous. To strike it directly seemed impossible, but Lu Bowen's eyes gleamed with calm purpose. He leaned close and whispered, "Fire is heaven's weapon. Use the wind. Let the elements fight for you." And so, before dawn, Zhu gave the order. Hundreds of small boats, filled with dry reeds, soaked in oil, were set alight. The wind shifted, blowing straight toward the enemy fleet. In moments, the night became a storm of flame. The fire roared across the lake, a living thing that devoured wood and man alike. Qin's ships, trapped by their own size, could not maneuver. One by one, they caught fire. The lake itself seemed to burn. When morning came, the waters of Poyang were black with smoke and ash. Qin Yuanyang's flagship, once so proud, lay cracked and broken, its banners sinking beneath the waves. The man who had declared himself heaven's chosen was struck by an arrow and fell into the flames. Zhu watched from the deck of his own ship, the wind tugging at his robes. He did not cheer. He did not smile. He only whispered, "May his soul find peace. Let this be the last time brother kills brother." The men beside him bowed their heads. Even in victory, there was sorrow. Do you ever wonder if the greatest victories feel more like grief than triumph? That even when you win, something inside you quietly breaks? Zhu Yuanzhang knew that feeling well. He had won the greatest battle of his life, but as the smoke drifted away, he saw the cost written on the faces of his men and on the still waters that had thousands below. That night, when the noise of war had faded, he walked alone to the lake's edge. The moonlight touched the waves, and the reflection trembled like a candle flame. He remembered the monastery bells, the empty bowl, the vow he had made long ago, that no man should ever starve or die for another's pride. He knelt and whispered, "Heaven, if I must lead, let me never forget why I began." The wind carried his words across the lake, over ashes, over silence, and toward the distant horizon where his destiny waited. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of battle faded, the waters of Lake Poyang returned to stillness. The sun rose gently over the wreckage, painting gold upon the ashes of war. Zhu Yuanzhang stood on the deck of his flagship, silent, the morning wind brushing against his face. Victory had come, but it did not bring joy. He looked upon the horizon and saw no glory there, only responsibility. The men around him had given everything. Now, it was time to give them something in return. Nanjing awaited him. Once a ruined city, it had become his refuge, his fortress, and now his vision. As Zhu entered through its gates, he saw peasants rebuilding homes from burnt timber, children chasing each other through dusty streets, and monks ringing bells in half-collapsed temples. The air was thick with smoke and life, the scent of survival. He dismounted, knelt, and pressed his hand into the earth. "This," he whispered, "is what we fight for." From that day, Nanjing became more than a city. It became a promise. He ordered the rebuilding of granaries and canals, the cleaning of roads that had been blocked by years of neglect. Farmers were given seed and tools from the army's own stores. Widows received rice from the state granaries, and orphans were placed under the protection of the monasteries. that had once sheltered him. Zhu's commands were simple. No man shall go hungry. No child shall sleep in the cold. At night, he walked the city walls alone. Lanterns flickered below, the river reflecting their light like stars fallen into the water. Beside him, Lu Bowen spoke softly. "You've given them bread. Now you must give them belief." Zhu turned to him. "Belief in what?" "In tomorrow," Lu said, "in the idea that suffering can end." The words lingered. So Zhu began something that few rulers before him had dared. He opened the palace gates once a week for petitions. Farmers, craftsmen, even beggars could come and speak. Their voices rose in fear at first, but when they saw the former beggar sitting before them, listening, the fear turned into hope. He remembered their faces, the calloused hands, the trembling voices, the tears. He had once been one of them, and in every plea for justice, he heard an echo of his own past. Do you think people can truly forgive an age of cruelty? Can hope return after so many winters of despair? Zhu Yuanzhang believed it could, but only if built with both law and mercy. He called upon scholars to write new codes, laws not of punishment alone, but of fairness. He ordered corrupt officers stripped of their rank, and established communal granaries to prepare for famine years. "Let us store grain when we can," he said, "for the sky remembers every empty stomach." And the people began to call him Ming Zhu, the Bright One. As the city flourished, visitors arrived from across the provinces. Some were refugees seeking work, others were soldiers returning home. In their eyes, Zhu saw the same mixture of exhaustion and belief. He welcomed them all. Every brick that rose, every wall repaired, was not just a piece of architecture. It was an act of healing. Under his command, Nanjing began to shine again, its markets filled with laughter, its temples alive with prayer, its harbor crowded with boats carrying rice, silk, and dreams. Yet peace is never still for long. Far to the north, the Mongols still ruled from their crumbling capital. Their envoys sent threats. Their generals rallied old loyalties. Zhu knew the next storm was coming, but now, unlike before, he had a foundation to protect. He looked across his city and said quietly, "If I must fight again, it will not be for conquest. It will be to keep this light alive." That evening, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, washing the dust from rooftops, turning the streets into ribbons of silver. Zhu stood beneath the eaves of the palace and watched. The people were laughing in the rain, merchants pulling cloth over their stalls, children splashing barefoot through puddles. For the first time in years, laughter echoed louder than fear. He turned to Lu Bowen and said, "Perhaps heaven isn't found in temples or palaces. Perhaps it lives right here in their joy." Lu smiled, the rain beating on his robes. "Then keep it alive, my lord. That is the truest kind of immortality." And as the rain washed over the reborn city, Zhu Yuanzhang felt something he had not felt since childhood. Not victory, not pride, but peace. Winter was fading from the land, and with it, the long shadow of despair. The rivers thawed, the air softened, and across the provinces, the banners of the Red Army rose once more. Nanjing, now a city reborn, watched as drums sounded along its walls. It was time. After years of famine, rebellion, and endless war, Zhu Yuanzhang was ready to march north, toward Dadu, the Mongol capital, and toward destiny itself. He stood upon the ramparts at dawn, his armor brushed with frost, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him stretched an army not of conquerors, but of survivors. Farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, monks, and orphans. Each man carried not only a weapon, but a memory of hunger, loss, and the promise that no one would ever starve again under heaven's sky. Zhu turned to them and said, "The north holds no treasure I desire, no crown made of gold, no palace carved from stone. What I seek lies within you, in your will to endure. We march not to rule, but to restore." The soldiers knelt, their breath rising like mist. Some wept quietly. Others clenched their fists against their hearts. It was not the cry of conquest that filled the air, but something gentler, the sound of faith. When the army set out, the earth trembled beneath their march. The drums beat in rhythm with the wind. Villagers came out from fields and roadsides, watching as the tide of men moved past, offering rice, water, and silent prayers. Old women burned incense at doorways. Children waved cloth banners stitched with the words, "Return of the Han." Each mile north carried both hope and memory. Along the riverbanks, Zhu saw the scars of old battles. Villages burned to dust, temples toppled, bridges shattered. He dismounted often, walking among the ruins, speaking softly to those who remained. To a farmer who had lost his sons, he said, "I cannot give them back, but I can give your grandchildren peace." To a widow who wept at the road's edge, he bowed his head. "No emperor should make widows of his people," he murmured. "Do you believe one man can heal what centuries have broken? Can compassion carry an army farther than steel?" Zhu Yuanzhang believed it could, because his power did not come from fear. It came from shared suffering, and from the courage to rise again. As the army crossed the Yellow River, news arrived that the Mongol garrisons were crumbling. Their emperors, once feared, now hid behind palace walls. Famine had struck their ranks, and even their loyal tribes turned away. For years, they had ruled through arrogance. Now heaven had turned its face from them. Zhu's generals urged haste, but Lu Bowen counseled patience. "Victory is not taken," he said. "It is received when the time is right." So Zhu waited for the rains to pass, for the roads to dry, for heaven to open the path before him. At last, in the summer of 1368, his banners reached the plain south of Dadu. The once proud capital stood silent, its towers gray beneath gathering clouds. The Mongol court had already fled beyond the Great Wall. There would be no grand battle, no clash of empires, only a weary surrender to the inevitable. Zhu entered the city at dawn. The streets were empty but for stray dogs and drifting paper charms. In the silence, his footsteps echoed like the toll of a distant bell. He looked upon the marble gates, the palaces still bearing the mark of foreign rule, and whispered, "Let the wind carry their names away. From this day, China belongs again to her people." Then he knelt, not before any throne, but before heaven itself. The generals around him followed, their armor clattering softly as they bowed. There was no roar of triumph, only the hush of wind through broken halls, and the steady breath of men who had survived the impossible. Later, when the proclamation was read, it was simple and unadorned. The great Ming has been founded. Heaven's mandate is restored. The date was recorded as the year 1368. The beggar had become an emperor. The orphan had become the guardian of a nation. That night, he stood atop the walls of Dadu, now Beijing, and watched the stars shimmer above the northern sky. He thought of Ma, the woman who had walked beside him when he had nothing, and of all those who had fallen on the road that led here. He closed his eyes and whispered, "If they can see me now, let them know. I have not forgotten." The wind carried his words into the night, and somewhere beyond the walls, the river sang softly, as if the world itself had begun to breathe again. The year was 1368. The cold winds from the north drifted softly through the streets of Dadu, carrying away the banners of a fallen empire. From the ashes of the Yuan, a new dawn rose. Not sudden, not loud, but like morning light slipping gently through broken clouds. In Nanjing, messengers rode through the gates of the rebuilt palace, their horses foaming, their faces bright with disbelief. The word spread like a spark in dry grass. The Mongols have fled. The north is free. Zhu Yuanzhang stood before the ancestral altar in a hall still smelling of fresh timber and incense. The air trembled with silence. Around him were soldiers, scholars, monks, all who had walked beside him through hunger and chaos. On the altar burned a single candle, its flame steady against the draft. He bowed 3 times. his voice quiet but clear. By heaven's will, by the hearts of the people, I take upon myself the mandate to restore order beneath the sky. Let this dynasty be called Ming, the Bright. Outside, the bells of Nanjing rang across the river. Farmers paused at their plows. Children lifted their faces to the wind. For the first time in living memory, the land felt whole again. Zhu's eyes glistened as he looked upon his companions. Lu Bowen, the calm counselor, Su De, the steadfast general, and the men who had followed him barefoot through years of dust and blood. "This is not my victory," he said softly. "It belongs to those who never stopped believing the world could be mended." That evening, the new emperor, now Han Guo, vastly martial, walked alone through the palace gardens. The lotus ponds reflected the pale moon. He could still hear the faint laughter of children outside the walls, the rhythm of hammers rebuilding homes, the whispers of monks chanting prayers of peace. Everything he had ever fought for, food, order, dignity, was now in his hands, and that frightened him more than any battle ever had. Do you ever wonder what happens after a dream comes true? When the fighting ends and silence begins, what do you do with that silence? For Zhu Yuanzhang, it became reflection. He spent his nights writing decrees by candlelight, his calligraphy firm unadorned. He banned extravagant feasts, punished corruption, and rewarded those who served the people rather than themselves. When courtiers flattered him, he frowned and said, "I have no use for honeyed words. Bring me truth, even if it stings." He sent edicts to every province. Rebuild the fields. Restore the canals. Let every man who lost his home have land again. Officials who ignored the suffering of peasants were stripped of rank. Scholarship was honored, but not vanity. Soldiers were given land to farm when wars ended, so they would never need to steal again. In the countryside, the people called it the Quiet Year. For the first time, grain filled the granaries, markets reopened, and temple bells replaced the drums of war. Women wove silk in peace. Men sang as they harvested rice. Even the air seemed lighter, as if the land itself had exhaled. One night, Lu Bowen came to the emperor carrying a small clay bowl, the same kind that monks use for alms. He placed it on the table beside the throne. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. Zhu smiled faintly. "It's been many years." "It was yours," Lu said, "when you begged for rice outside a temple. Keep it near you, Majesty. Let it remind you that all thrones begin in hunger." Zhu nodded and placed his hand upon the bowl. The clay was cool, rough, honest, like the earth itself. At dawn, he stood atop the walls of Nanjing and watched the mist roll across the Yangtze. The river glimmered gold beneath the rising sun. He whispered, "Let this light reach every valley, every village, every heart that has forgotten hope." From that day, the Ming Dynasty began, a kingdom born not from conquest alone, but from endurance, from memory, and from the belief that compassion could rebuild what cruelty had destroyed. And somewhere beyond the river, as morning broke over the fields of China, a farmer lifted his head to the light and smiled. The halls of Nanjing were filled with the scent of ink and paper. Morning light filtered through carved windows, falling upon scrolls spread wide across long wooden tables. Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang, the man who once begged for rice, now bent over maps and decrees, his brush steady, his brow furrowed. The empire had been reborn, but order was fragile. He knew peace must be built not on mercy alone, but upon laws that even kings must obey. Outside, the bells of the capital rang softly. Farmers brought tribute of grain. Scholars gathered at the newly reopened academies, and craftsmen repaired bridges and canals. Life had returned, but beneath the calm, Zhu sensed something dangerous, the return of complacency. "People forget too quickly," he murmured to Lu Bowen one morning. "When hunger ends, so does humility. If the roots are not tended, weeds of greed will grow again." Lu smiled gently. "Then tend the roots, Majesty." Let your laws be the rein, firm, but just. And so began the creation of the Ming Code, one of the most intricate systems of law in China's history. Zhu summoned scholars, monks, and judges from every province. They gathered in the Hall of Bright Governance, where the air buzzed with the sound of debate. What is justice? He asked them. Is it punishment or prevention? For days, they argued. Some said fear kept men loyal. Others said compassion guided hearts better than chains. Zhu listened to all, then said quietly, "A good law does not frighten the innocent, but it must make the wicked tremble." The new code took shape like the slow carving of jade, patient, deliberate, eternal. It defined rights and duties, outlined crimes and their penalties, but also decreed that no official, no matter how high, was above the people they governed. An official who steals from the hungry, Zhu declared, is worse than a thief in the night. A thief takes one meal. A corrupt man takes 10,000. To ensure fairness, he revived the village registers, records of every household, field, and harvest. Taxes were balanced according to land, not favor. Inspectors traveled secretly through provinces, listening to peasants and reporting directly to the throne. It was a vast effort, exhausting, endless. But Zhu endured. He remembered the cold nights of his youth, when injustice was a fire that burned unseen. Do you think a man who has known hunger can ever truly rest, while others starve? He could not. Each night, long after the palace lamps had dimmed, he sat alone at his desk, copying lines from the Confucian classics. Govern with virtue, one passage said, but anchor virtue with law. He nodded, dipped his brush again, and added his own note. Law without compassion is tyranny. Compassion without law is chaos. In the countryside, his policies began to bear fruit. Fields were measured fairly, canals cleared, and villages once abandoned began to bloom again. Children studied under the eaves of rebuilt schools. Monks reopened temples to feed the poor. Even the rivers seemed to flow more gently. But with every reform came resistance. Rich landowners protested the new surveys. Old officials resented being watched. Zhu's patience thinned. "I will not allow corruption to grow like moss beneath clean water," he said. He ordered harsh punishments for those who deceived the state. Some whispered that the emperor had grown severe. Yet for Zhu, justice was sacred, the shield that protected the weak from the cunning. One evening, as thunder rolled beyond the city walls, Lu Bowen found him still writing. "Majesty," he said softly, "you cannot make all men righteous. Even heaven allows storms." Zhu looked up from his scroll. "Then I will build roofs strong enough to withstand them." They stepped out into the courtyard. Rain fell in silver lines through the lamplight. Servants ran to cover the scrolls from the wind, but Zhu simply tilted his face to the sky, letting the rain wash over him. "Once, this was the only water I had to drink," he said. "Now it cleanses what I build. Heaven gives, and heaven takes. But as long as I breathe, the people will not suffer as I did." The next morning, the Ming Code was completed, bound in silk and sealed with wax. It was carried through every province. In its pages, justice had found a voice, firm, simple, and enduring. And for a while at least, the empire of the Bright Ming shone with both mercy and order. The year after the Ming Code was finished, the empire entered its first true spring of peace. The rivers ran clear again. Fields that had once been wastelands now shimmered with young rice. Across the valleys, smoke from cooked fires rose in thin, calm spirals, a quiet signal that hunger had, at last, retreated. But within the palace, the emperor was restless. He had restored law and order, yet his heart felt heavy, as if something essential was missing, a voice he could no longer hear. One morning, he told his attendants, "Prepare no banners, no guards, no music. I will go out among the people, not as an emperor, but as a man." Lu Bowen tried to protest. "It is dangerous, Majesty. The world still hides knives in its shadows." Zhu smiled faintly. Then let them see I am made of flesh, not gold. He dressed in simple cotton, tied his robe with a hemp cord, and left the city through a small northern gate before dawn. The air was cool and full of dew. Birds stirred in the reeds, and far ahead, farmers were already at work. For the first time in years, Zhu Yuanzhang walked without ceremony, his boots sinking softly into the wet soil of his youth. He came upon a small village by the river, a handful of thatched roofs, smoke rising from cooking fires. An old farmer bent over a plow pulled by an ox whose ribs showed faintly through its hide. Zhu stopped and watched for a while before approaching. "Good morning, elder," he said. The farmer wiped his brow, squinting against the sunlight. "You travel early, friend. Are you lost?" Zhu smiled. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I came to see how the world truly fares." The farmer chuckled. "Then look around. The weeds still grow faster than the rice." He offered Zhu a cup of water from a clay jar. It was warm, tasting faintly of earth and iron, the taste of survival. They sat beneath a mulberry tree. Zhu asked, "Tell me, are the taxes fair now? Are the soldiers kind?" The old man shrugged. "Fairer than before. We pay what we can. But I'll tell you this, I'd rather give grain to an honest official than lose it to locusts." Zhu laughed softly. "And which of the two do you fear more these days?" "Neither," the man said, grinning through missing teeth. "Heaven has been kind lately." For a long while, they spoke like equals, about soil and weather, about the stubbornness of oxen and the patience of seeds. Zhu listened, really listened, as though every word was a treasure. No official report, no court memorial could ever tell him what this man's voice did. "Do you ever dream of the old days?" Zhu asked. The farmer's eyes dimmed. "Sometimes, when there was nothing to eat. I buried my tools because I thought I'd never need them again. But the land waited for me. It always does. It forgives more than men ever will." The words settled deep in Zhu's heart. He thought of the burned fields of his childhood, of his mother's hands cracking from hunger, of the monastery bell that had once saved him from despair. He looked at the farmer and said quietly, "Would you tell the emperor that, if you could speak to him?" The old man snorted. "The emperor? He's far too busy for the likes of me." Zhu smiled gently. "Perhaps not as far as you think. Do you think rulers forget where they come from? Or do you believe the past walks beside them, whispering, reminding, humbling?" When the sun began to sink, Zhu rose. He bowed to the old farmer, deeply, respectfully. "Thank you for your water and your truth," he said. The farmer blinked, confused, then laughed. "Come back during harvest," he said. "You can share a bowl of wine with us then." Zhu nodded. "I will." As he walked away, the sound of the plow faded behind him. He turned once more and saw the farmer still at work, a small figure moving steadily against the golden light. It was a simple sight, but in it lay everything Zhu had ever fought for. That night, back in the palace, he placed his crown aside and poured himself a single cup of that same earthy wine. He whispered, "Heaven may rule from above, but peace is built from the ground." Outside, in the quiet fields of China, the wind passed softly through the rice stalks, a lullaby of gratitude and growth. Night fell gently over Nanjing. The palace, once filled with the sounds of drums and messengers, now echoed only with the faint hum of crickets beyond its red walls. The emperor sat alone in the hall of benevolent governance, the lamplight flickering across scrolls stacked like mountains. He had built an empire of order, yet the silence around him grew heavier with each passing year. Power, he realized, was its own kind of solitude. In his early days, the palace had been alive. Voices of ministers debating law, laughter of soldiers celebrating victories. His wife, Empress Ma, reading beside him as they shared warm rice and quiet smiles. But now she was gone. Her gentle counsel, her ability to soften his fury with a glance, had faded into memory. Her chambers remained untouched, her robes neatly folded. a faint scent of jasmine still clinging to the air. Every night, Zhu Yuanzhang walked past her empty room. He would pause, just for a moment, and whisper to the shadows, "You would tell me when I was wrong." The silence, as always, gave no reply. Outside, the empire prospered. Grain stores overflowed, rivers ran clear, and taxes were collected fairly. Yet inside the palace, mistrust began to creep like ivy through stone. Officials whispered, factions formed. And Zhu, once the peasant who trusted his comrades like brothers, began to see deceit in every polite smile. "Majesty," said Lu Bowen one evening, "even the brightest flame cast shadows." Zhu looked up sharply, and shadows must be driven out. "But not all are enemies," Lu replied gently. "Some are only the cost of light." Zhu turned away. "You speak like a scholar, but I have lived as a man who has been betrayed by hunger, by greed, by kings. If I cannot trust, at least I can command." That night, thunder rolled across the river. The emperor did not sleep. He walked through the silent courtyards of the palace, past guards who bowed without meeting his eyes, past gardens once bright with laughter, now kept in immaculate stillness. Rain began to fall, whispering against the roof tiles like distant weeping. He stopped beside the lotus pond where he and Empress Ma had once fed fish together. The water, black under the storm, reflected his face. Older now, sharper, lonely. He tossed a single seed into the pond and murmured, "Even the purest lotus grows from mud." Do you think peace ever truly satisfies those who have known war? Or does it only remind them of what they've lost along the way? By morning, Zhu summoned his court. His voice was calm but cold. "I will have no corruption in this palace. No deceit, no hidden greed. If any man betrays the people's trust, let heaven witness his fall." The hall fell silent. Officials trembled, some with guilt, others with fear. Zhu's justice, once a shield for the weak, was becoming a sword for control. In the following months, he ordered investigations, purges of dishonest governors, and trials that reached even into the highest ranks. Many who had once fought beside him were accused, imprisoned, or quietly vanished from the records. Each sentence signed was a weight upon his heart, but he believed it necessary. The empire must be clean, he told himself, even if I must wash it in sorrow. When Lu Bowen fell ill and requested leave to return home, Zhu visited him in private. The counselor lay pale beneath thin blankets, his voice faint. "You have given China a future," he whispered. "Now give yourself peace." Zhu gripped his hand. "Peace. I no longer know what that word means." Lu smiled weakly. "Then go back to where it was born, among your people." He died that night. For days, the emperor said nothing. The palace grew quieter still. The walls that had once sheltered laughter now seemed to close in around him. He began spending his evenings in the archives, reading letters from generals long gone, tracing their handwriting as though trying to summon the warmth of their loyalty. Sometimes, he would stop and look out at the city lights beyond the palace walls. He could hear faint music from the streets, laughter from taverns, the rhythm of drums from a wedding procession. It made him smile, just for a moment. Perhaps that was heaven's way of reminding him that even an emperor lives beneath the same sky as the people he governs. As he extinguished his lamp that night, he whispered, "The palace may be silent, but if laughter still rises beyond these walls, then perhaps all is well." Outside, the rain had stopped. The night air carried the scent of wet earth, and somewhere far away, a farmer sang softly as he worked by moonlight. The years passed like fading ink on silk. The empire was peaceful, the borders secure, the granaries full. And yet, within the walls of the Forbidden Palace, the air grew colder. Zhu Yuanzhang, once the humble monk who united a broken nation, now felt the weight of every heartbeat beneath heaven's sky. He could no longer walk freely among the people. The streets that once welcomed him were now lined with guards. The laughter of farmers, once familiar, had been replaced by the cautious bows of courtiers. He had built the Ming upon law, justice, and compassion, but power had built a wall around his heart. Each night, he dreamed of betrayal, old comrades smiling as they plunged knives between loyalty and ambition, letters from officials blurred before his eyes, their praise too perfect, their obedience too quick. He began to wonder, had they followed me because they believed, or because they feared? Even the sound of footsteps in the corridor stirred unease. He began to trust only ink and silence. Laws grew stricter, punishments harsher. Whispers of rebellion, even unfounded, were crushed before they could take root. He created the Zhengde, the Brocade Guards, an elite force sworn to protect the throne and to watch everyone else. Their presence was silent, their power absolute. Even ministers feared their shadows in the candlelight. One evening, the emperor stood by the window of his study, watching lanterns sway in the distance. The city beyond the walls glowed softly under the moon. "Do they still sing?" he asked his attendant. "Yes, Majesty," came the quiet reply. "The people are content." Zhu nodded, but his voice was distant. "Content, yes, but do they remember why?" He turned to the Kaleom's bowl beside his desk, the one Lu Bowen had given him years before. Its surface was cracked now, its rim chipped. He traced its edge with his thumb. "This was once all I owned," he whispered. "Now I own the world, and yet it feels emptier." Do you think power ever fills the void it creates? Or does it only deepen it? Like water filling a well that has no bottom? As the years deepened, the emperor's fears hardened into habit. He saw treachery and hesitation, rebellion and disagreement. Ministers learned to speak carefully, to praise often, to avoid truth. Those who had once been his brothers in arms now walked with their eyes lowered. And yet, beneath the steel of command, a faint sadness lingered. Late at night, when the palace slept, Zhu would walk alone through the corridors, listening to the wind moving between the pillars. Sometimes he thought he heard voices, the laughter of soldiers at Poyang, the songs of peasants from Nanjing, his wife's gentle hum from long ago. He would stop, close his eyes, and let the echoes wash over him. One evening, a young guard caught him wandering barefoot in the rain. The guard dropped to his knees in shock, but Zhu only smiled faintly. "Do you know why I built walls this high?" The guard shook his head. "So the wind cannot reach me," the emperor said. "But I forgot. The wind is what kept me alive." The next morning, he summoned his scribes. "Write this," he said. "When a ruler loses the trust of men, he rules only their bodies, never their hearts. Let my sons remember, fear builds silence, not loyalty." The scribes looked at one another in awe. Was this an order or a confession? Zhu did not say. Outside, the lotus ponds bloomed again, their pale petals open to the sunlight, unaware of the man behind the walls who once promised to protect them. As he sat in the fading light of afternoon, Zhu Yuanzhang whispered to the empty hall, "I gave them peace, but I forgot that peace needs kindness as much as law." The sound of the evening bell drifted through the air, slow, mournful, steady. He closed his eyes, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the emperor felt like the monk he once was, a man beneath heaven, not above it. The years had turned the emperor's hair silver. His hands, once calloused from the plow, now trembled when holding a brush. Outside the walls of Nanjing, the Yangtze River still flowed, slow, eternal, indifferent to time. The great Ming, his creation, stretched from sea to mountain, a vast empire of peace and order. And yet, inside the palace, the man who built it felt the world grow quieter with every sunrise. Zhu Yuanzhang spent his mornings in the garden now, feeding carp from the pond where once he had spoken to the moon. Sometimes he would sit for hours, without saying a word, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the far-off laughter of children in the city below. It was a sound he never tired of, proof that life went on without him. One morning, he called for his youngest grandson. The boy, barely 10, entered shyly, bowing low. Zhu smiled faintly. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, holding up a small clay bowl. The boy shook his head. "It fed me when I was a beggar," Zhu said. "It taught me what hunger is, and what compassion means." He placed the bowl in the child's hands. "Never forget that this, not the crown, is what makes a ruler worthy." The boy stared at it, confused but solemn. "Grandfather," he whispered, "were you happy being emperor?" Zhu looked toward the window, where sunlight spilled through the lattice in golden patterns. "I was happy when I had nothing," he said softly, "because then every kindness felt like heaven's gift." Do you ever think about what you would ask heaven if you had only one more question to whisper before you left this world? For Zhu, the question was simple. Did I bring peace, or only silence? He spent his final years writing letters, not to kings or generals, but to the people of the provinces. They were read aloud in village squares, each one written with the same care as a prayer. To the farmers, he wrote, "Guard your fields as you would guard your children. The strength of our land lies in the hands that till it." To the scholars, he said, "Let your words be bridges, not walls." To my sons, he warned, "Remember that fear may build obedience, but only virtue builds faith." Each stroke of his brush was deliberate, as if he were carving his soul into the paper. At night, he dreamed of the old monastery. He saw himself again, young, barefoot, standing beneath a bell tower, his bowl empty, his heart full of questions. He remembered the monk who once told him, "The world is vast, but peace begins with one quiet mind." He had built an empire to prove those words true, and now, in the twilight of his life, he finally understood their meaning. In the summer of 1398, illness came softly, like an old friend. The court doctors brought medicines, but he waved them away. "Do not chase what heaven has already called back," he said gently. He summoned his heir and a few loyal ministers. "Do not build statues of me," he told them. "Do not carve my name in gold. Let my memory live in the fields, in the canals, in the laughter of the people. If they eat well and sleep in peace, that is monument enough." As dusk fell, he asked to be carried to the window. The sky burned with the colors of sunset, a sea of red and gold that mirrored the flags of the dynasty he had founded. He smiled faintly. "It seems even heaven honors the name Ming tonight." Then he whispered, "Tell the people, I never forgot them." His hand slipped from the armrest, and the clay bowl, his oldest companion, rolled gently onto the floor, coming to rest beside his chair. Its rim cracked, but did not break. The palace bell rang once, low and deep. Across the city, the sound echoed, through markets, temples, and quiet homes. Somewhere, a farmer paused mid-harvest and looked to the horizon. The sky above Nanjing glowed softly, as if mourning and gratitude had become one. And so ended the life of Zhu Yuanzhang, the beggar who became emperor, the monk who became the father of a dynasty. He left behind not perfection, but a path that even in a world ruled by power, a heart guided by compassion can still light the way. After Zhu Yuanzhang's passing, the palace corridors seemed to hold their breath. The great emperor's shadow lingered in the marble floors, in the silence of court meetings, and in the trembling hearts of his sons. The throne passed not to the fierce warriors among them, but to the gentle-hearted crown prince's son, Zhu Yuanzhang, the Zhengde emperor, young and idealistic. At first, his reign promised harmony. He spoke softly of compassion, of undoing his grandfather's harshness. He freed old ministers, once imprisoned by fear, and ordered temples to pray for the late Hongwu's peace. But in the north, far from the palace, one man watched these changes with unease. The Prince of Yan, Zhu Di, fourth son of the founding emperor, lord of Beiping, the city that would one day be called Beijing. Zhu Di was no longer young. He had fought Mongol raiders, commanded armies, and governed the frontier with discipline and skill. To him, the empire was not a dream of kindness, It was a structure held together by strength, and strength, he believed, was slipping away. At first, he sent letters to the new emperor, pledging loyalty, offering advice, but the palace whispered otherwise. Beware the Prince of Yen. He is ambitious. He waits for the throne. Soon, envoys stopped coming. His allies were recalled, his sons taken as hostages. Zhu Di felt the circle tightening. One night, under the northern stars, he walked the city walls of Beiping. The wind was cold, and snow clung to his armor. His general, Zhang Yu, bowed beside him. "Your Majesty's grandson seeks to humble you," Zhang said. Zhu Di's gaze remained on the horizon. Then he forgets who taught him to stand tall. Silence followed, broken only by the moan of winter wind. Then Zhu Di spoke again, his voice calm, almost sorrowful. "If heaven grants me victory, I will rule not for vengeance, but for restoration. Do you believe power can never be taken without blood? Or does the road to destiny always pass through fire?" In the spring of 1399, the drums of rebellion began. Zhu Di raised his banner, not against the emperor, he claimed, but against the traitorous ministers who misled him. It was a careful lie, wrapped in righteousness. His soldiers marched under the slogan, "Cleanse the court, save the empire." For 3 years, the land burned once more. Cities changed hands like playing stones. Fathers and sons fought under different flags, each claiming heaven's favor. Even as the war raged, Zhu Di wrote letters to his enemies, urging them to surrender in the name of peace. Some believed him, others cursed him. In 1402, his armies reached Nanjing, the old heart of his father's dream. The city resisted fiercely, but fire and betrayal opened its gates. When Zhu Di entered the capital, the sky was red with smoke, and the air heavy with the scent of ash and loss. The Zhengde emperor vanished. Some said he fled in disguise, others that he perished in the flames of his own palace. Zhu Di stood before the ruins of the throne hall, the same hall where his father had once knelt before heaven, and whispered, "Forgive me, Father. I have done what I must to preserve your work." Days later, he proclaimed himself emperor. His reign name would be Yongle, eternal joy. But joy and truth was the one thing he would never again find. That night, he climbed the same palace tower where his father had watched the sunrise. The city below glowed faintly, scarred yet alive. He closed his eyes and listened to the faint hum of life, to the wind that still carried his father's voice. "You have built peace, my son," that imagined voice whispered. But peace without mercy is only another kind of storm. Zhu Di opened his eyes and looked to the north, to the wide plains where his destiny had begun. He swore that he would build a new capital there, a city grand enough to humble time itself, a city of stone and gold that would outshine the world. And thus began the reign of Yongle, a ruler born of fire, guided by brilliance, haunted by the silence of all he had lost. The morning air in Beiping carried the scent of pine and dust. The northern plains stretched wide, pale beneath the rising sun. Here, where Mongol hooves had once thundered, Emperor Yongle stood upon a hill and saw, not wilderness, but destiny. "This," he said softly, "will be the heart of the world." Around him, ministers shifted uneasily. The old capital, Nanjing, was safe, prosperous, familiar. To move the throne north, closer to the frontier, closer to danger, seemed madness. But Zhu Di's gaze held the certainty of mountains. "Nanjing was my father's dream," he said. "Beijing will be mine." And so began the greatest act of creation since the founding of the dynasty. Tens of thousands of workers flooded the plains. Stone from distant quarries arrived by river and ox cart. Timber from the jungles of Yunnan was floated north on rafts, each log marked with red lacquer and a prayer. They worked in silence and in song, hammering, carving, measuring, their sweat mixing with the soil that would become Beijing, the northern capital. At the center of it all, Yongle envisioned a palace like no other, a city within a city. where heaven and earth would meet in perfect symmetry. Its walls would gleam with red and gold. Its gates would face the cardinal winds. Its throne would sit at the point where destiny and geometry became one. The architects called it the Forbidden City. To the emperor, it was something simpler, a temple of order, a monument to balance. By day, he walked among the builders, his robes trailing through dust and sawdust. He asked the artisans their names, praised the masons whose hands bled from chiseling stone. "Let every man who labors here," he said, "know that he builds not for a ruler, but for the ages." By night, he sat in a tent lit by a single lantern, studying maps and scrolls. The stars above the northern sky reminded him of his father's lessons, that heaven's order could guide even the will of kings. He sought to mirror that sky upon the earth, each hall, each courtyard, aligned with celestial precision. Sometimes he would rise in the darkness and walk to the building site. The skeleton of the palace stretched before him like a sleeping dragon. The wind would whistle through the bamboo scaffolds, and the sound felt almost alive, as if the new capital was breathing, dreaming, waiting. Do you believe cities can remember? That stone can hold memory the way people hold love. Perhaps that is why Yongle built so carefully, because he knew that even emperors fade. But their cities, if built in harmony, could whisper their stories for eternity. Years turned into decades. Disasters came and went, floods, fires, rumors of revolt. But the emperor's vision did not waver. He oversaw the construction of canals linking north and south, so grain could flow to his capital like blood through arteries. He rebuilt the Great Wall, each brick bearing silent testimony to the labor of men unseen. The empire pulsed again, vibrant, disciplined, alive. In 1420, the Forbidden City was completed. From its southern gate to its northern towers, it shone like a jewel beneath the pale northern sky. Red walls, golden roofs, marble courtyards where echoes lingered for centuries. On the day of its consecration, Yongle climbed the Meridian Gate alone. From there, he looked down upon his creation. Drums rolled, bells rang. The city below stretched endless, a sea of rooftops glowing in morning light. He whispered, "Father, I have built a world worthy of your dream." But when the crowds dispersed and the sun began to set, he remained there still, unmoving. For in the perfection of the city, he felt the imperfection of his own heart. No monument could erase the blood that had brought him here. The wind blew across the tiles, carrying a single yellow leaf past his feet. He bent down, picked it up, and smiled faintly. "All things," he said, "even glory, must fall gently someday." That night, as lanterns glowed across the new capital, the emperor walked alone through its silent corridors. The polished stones reflected his steps. Each echo seemed to ask the same quiet question: was this heaven's will, or merely mine? The moon rose above the golden roofs, casting its silver light across the city that would outlast him, a city that still stands, holding within its walls the breath of a man who dreamed of eternity. Night over the South China Sea was endless. The sky shimmered with 1,000 stars, and below, their reflections danced upon the waves like liquid fire. From the deck of his great ship, Admiral Zheng, he looked toward the horizon, the dark curve where heaven met the unknown. Behind him stretched a fleet unlike any the world had ever seen. 300 ships, their sails pale as moonlight, their hulls carved with dragons, phoenixes, and clouds. The largest, the treasure ships, towered like floating cities, each longer than a football field, their decks carrying soldiers, scholars, merchants, and dreams. At the heart of it all, an emperor's vision. In Beijing, far from the sea, Yongle had looked at maps inked with myths, and said, "Let the world know China's light." For years, he had built walls, palaces, canals, but now he wanted horizons. He wanted to send his empire's name across the waves, not through conquest, but through awe. And so Zheng he sailed. He was no ordinary man, born a Muslim in Yunnan, captured as a boy. He had served the Yongle emperor with devotion deeper than fear. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to see both earth and heaven, he commanded not just by order, but by presence. On the first voyage in 1405, the fleet left Nanjing under banners red and gold, the drums echoing down the Yangtze like thunder. Villagers gathered along the riverbanks, watching the ships vanish into mist, a moving city of sails and song. For months, they followed the wind south, past Vietnam, the jungles of Java, the spices of Malacca, until they reached the wide blue edge of the Indian Ocean. Do you know that feeling when you look at the sea, and it feels as if the world itself is breathing? That was what the sailors felt each dawn, when the sun rose red behind the sails, and the world seemed both infinite and fragile. In Calicut, they met kings who marveled at their ships. In Ceylon, they built stone tablets praising both Buddha and Allah. In Arabia, they saw deserts vast as the sea itself. And when they reached the coast of Africa, they brought back wonders that seemed carved from dreams. Ivory, spices, pearls, and a giraffe, whose long neck made courtiers whisper that heaven had sent a dragon. Every port became a reflection of the empire's greatness, not through war, but through splendor. They gave gifts of silk and porcelain, received tribute of gems and gold. They brought with them music, medicine maps, and stories that crossed oceans long before books did. Yet even glory carries its weight. Storms tore ships apart. Many never returned. And in the stillness between voyages, Zhengde would sometimes stand alone on the deck, listening to the groan of wood and wind, and wonder if heaven truly smiled upon men who dared so far. He wrote in his logbook, "The sea is vast and patient. It remembers everything." By the time of the seventh voyage, his hair had turned gray, his steps slower. He had seen more of the world than any man of his age, and perhaps more loneliness than any emperor could imagine. In 1433, somewhere near Calicut, Zhengde fell ill. He ordered the fleet to turn home. One night, as the ships drifted beneath a full moon, he sat alone in his cabin and whispered, "If I die here, let them bury me at sea. The waves have been my home." When morning came, he was gone. The sailors wrapped his body in white silk, placed him in the waters he had loved, and watched as the ocean closed above him, softly, like a mother tucking in her child. Back in Beijing, when word reached Yongle's descendants, the court wept, but the voyages ended. No emperor after him would sail so far again. The great ships were left to rot in their harbors, their timbers swallowed by silence. Centuries later, fishermen still claimed that, on moonlit nights, they could see ghostly sails upon the horizon, vast and golden, carrying the whisper of drums from another age. And perhaps, if you stand by the sea long enough, you can hear it too, the voice of Zhengde, calling not for conquest, but for wonder, because sometimes the greatest empire a man can build is not on land, but upon the endless heart of the sea. The northern wind whispered through the golden roofs of the Forbidden City. From the high towers, one could see the city spread out in perfect order, avenues straight as arrows, walls glowing red beneath the morning sun. It was the image of harmony, and yet, within the heart of the palace, the man who built it felt only restlessness. Emperor Yongle sat before a bronze mirror, its surface polished to a gleam that caught every flicker of light. He stared into it, not at his reflection, but at something beyond, as though heaven itself might appear if he looked long enough. "The empire is vast," he murmured, "but my peace grows smaller each day." In the 22nd year of his reign, the empire stood unmatched in power. The Great Wall had been rebuilt. The canals linked north and south like veins of silver. The fleets of Zheng, he had brought tribute from lands once only imagined. And yet, within the walls of his magnificent capital, silence had grown heavy. He missed the sound of his father's voice, the rough laughter of the peasant who became a god. He missed the simplicity of the campfires along the frontier. Power had given him the world, but stolen from him the warmth of small things. Each night, when the lanterns were dimmed, he would walk through the courtyards alone. His footsteps echoed against marble and jade. Sometimes he paused before the Hall of Supreme Harmony and whispered, "Father, is this what heaven meant for me?" Do you ever wonder what greatness feels like when there's no one left to share it with? One winter morning, the emperor summoned his astronomer, a quiet man named Wushojing. The scholar brought charts of stars and eclipses, maps of heaven mirrored upon the earth. "Your Majesty," he said, "the sky has shifted. A new star has appeared in the northern crown." Yongle smiled faintly. "Perhaps it is heaven's messenger," he said, "or perhaps it is my father watching." He rose, walking to the window. Snow drifted down softly upon the forbidden city, turning red roofs to white. The city seemed to sleep, the breath of a giant dream frozen in silence. He thought of the lives that had built it, the farmers who cut stone, the laborers who died hauling timber from the jungles of Yunnan, the sailors who vanished beyond the horizon. Every monument he had raised was built upon the hands of men he would never know. And now, in the quiet of age, he wondered if their ghosts followed him through these perfect halls. When illness began to creep into his body, he refused to rest. Reports spoke of unrest along the frontier, of Mongol riders gathering once more. He ordered preparations for a new campaign, determined to ride north himself, as if victory might silence the unease within. Ministers begged him to remain in the capital, but Yongle only smiled. What is a dragon if it does not soar? In the summer of 1424, he led his armies beyond the Great Wall one last time. The air was dry, the sky a burning blue. He rode at the head of his men, his armor glinting like the sun on steel. But the fire that had carried him through life was fading. In camp, one night beneath the stars, he grew quiet. He asked for his mirror, the same bronze one he had kept since youth. When the attendants brought it, he held it up, gazing once more at his reflection. But this time he smiled. "The mirror of heaven," he said softly, "is not the stars, it is the heart." Those were his last words. At dawn he was gone, his tent still, his armor cold, his hand resting upon the mirror. When news reached Beijing, the court fell into mourning. They said the sky itself dimmed that day, the sun veiled in mist, as if the heavens had bowed their heads. His body was carried back to the capital he built, buried in the northern hills, where pines whisper endlessly. The forbidden city remained, a mirror of his ambition, a memory carved in stone. And those centuries have passed. On still nights, when the wind moves through the palace gates, it is said that a faint echo can still be heard, the sound of an emperor walking alone, searching for heaven in the reflection of his own creation. The palace slept under a pale dawn. Snow gathered quietly on red tiles, and the bronze cranes by the lake wore crowns of frost. Inside the Hall of Benevolent Tranquility, a young man rose before sunrise, bowing 3 times toward the north, toward the tomb of his father, the great Yongle Emperor. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang, known to history as the Zhengde Emperor. He was 30 when heaven's mandate passed to him. His father had conquered nations, but he would seek to conquer restlessness. The ministers watched him closely. Would he rule with iron, like his grandfather Hangwu, or with fire, like his father Yongle? Instead, he ruled with stillness, as if he had learned that even an empire, like a pond, reflects the sky best when calm. In his first decree, he wrote, "Let the people rest. Let the plow be mightier than the sword." He reopened the academies his father had silenced, recalling scholars who had fled in fear. He listened to their advice, not as commands, but as conversation. In his court, disagreement was no longer treason. Men spoke with caution still, but also with hope. He reduced taxes on farmers, forbade the forced relocation of peasants, and ordered that famine victims be fed before any official ceremony could begin. When asked why, he replied simply, An empty stomach cannot praise heaven. Do you ever think about how rare it is for power to be gentle? Zhengde understood that peace required strength, but not cruelty. He kept the armies trained, the borders secure, but he no longer sent fleets across oceans or armies beyond mountains. Instead, he rebuilt what the storms of ambition had broken: bridges, schools, canals, quiet miracles of stone and water. Even art seemed to breathe again. Under his reign, the imperial kilns of Zhengde glowed night and day, producing porcelains so delicate they sang when struck by a fingernail. Painters in his workshop captured mist and moonlight with brushes soft as whispers. He often visited them, dressed simply, asking, "How does one paint silence?" One artist, trembling, replied, "By painting nothing unnecessary, Your Majesty." The emperor smiled. "Then that must be how one rules as well." In the evenings, Zhengde would walk the gardens of the Forbidden City. He kept no entourage, only a lantern and a book of poems. He often paused beside the frozen pond, watching the reflection of stars ripple beneath the ice. He had known war, seen power, tasted fear, but here in stillness, he found meaning. Once, he asked his advisor, "Tell me, if my father had known peace as I do now, would he have been content?" The advisor bowed. "Your Majesty, even dragons tire of the storm, but only heaven can decide when they may rest." He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I will rule as a sleeping dragon." Beyond the palace, the people prospered. Fields were full, canals flowed clear, and merchants carried silk and porcelain to lands far away. Envoys from Japan, Siam, and the islands of the South Seas brought tribute to the court, not from fear, but from admiration. In this age, the world felt wide but safe. Children born during his reign would later say that the Zhengde years were like spring itself, gentle, warm, and brief. But even spring must end. In his 10th year as emperor, illness came upon him suddenly. He hid it at first, continuing to hold audiences, to write, to smile. But his strength faded quietly, like a candle that chooses not to trouble the dark. On his final evening, he asked to be carried to the pavilion overlooking the pond. Snow was falling again. He watched the flakes melt upon the lantern light and said, "I have seen what greatness builds. Now I wish to see what kindness leaves behind." He turned to his son, still a child, and whispered, "Do not chase heaven's favor. Earn the people's rest." At midnight, the snow ceased. The emperor closed his eyes and exhaled once, a breath so soft it barely stirred the air. The next morning, Beijing awoke under a sky of flawless blue. The cranes by the lake stood unmoving, their feathers white against the frozen water, and the people said, "The emperor has gone to walk among the clouds." The snow had melted from the eaves of the Forbidden City, but the air remained heavy, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to breathe. Emperor Zhengde was gone, and with him, the fragile balance of strength and mercy that had kept the empire at peace. His son was only 8 years old. They called him Zhu Yuanzhang, the Zhengde emperor, a child on the dragon throne, surrounded by men far older, far hungrier. At first, the ministers governed in his name. They quoted the classics, performed the rituals, spoke of harmony and virtue. But beneath the surface, factions grew like cracks in winter ice. The eunuchs whispered in corridors, scribes forged decrees, and generals eyed the northern frontier where the steppe winds blew. Each man believed he served heaven. Each man believed heaven spoke only to him. And the boy emperor, caught between ambition and advice, listened and grew silent. Do you remember the feeling of being small in a world too large? That was how Zhu Yuanzhang must have felt, sitting upon the golden throne, his feet not yet touching the ground, while ministers bowed so low they never saw his fear. Beyond the walls of the capital, the world was changing. In the north, the Mongols had not vanished. Under the cunning of Peasant Khan, they rebuilt their strength, riders sweeping across the plains like smoke reborn. They tested the Great Wall, found its cracks, and waited. Within the court, a new voice rose, that of a eunuch named Wang Zhen. Soft-spoken, loyal in appearance, but skilled in the politics of doors and shadows. He became the young emperor's tutor, then his guardian, then his master. Wang Zhen promised safety. He promised glory. And the boy, lonely for affection, believed him. By the time Zhu Yuanzhang reached manhood, the eunuch's power had become absolute. Petitions passed through his hands. Armies moved at his command. Ministers whispered of corruption, but none dared act. To oppose him was to vanish. In 1449, news came of Mongol incursions once more. Wang Zhen urged the emperor to lead an army himself, to prove his strength, to reclaim his father's glory. Against the council of generals and scholars alike, the emperor agreed. From Beijing, a massive army marched north, 500,000 men, their banners gleaming like fields of fire beneath the autumn sun. They believed heaven would favor them, as it once had favored Yongle. But heaven had grown silent. The campaign ended in disaster. At the Battle of Tumu, the Ming army was annihilated. The emperor himself was captured. The son of heaven, a prisoner of the steppe. For months, the empire trembled. Officials wept in the capital. Families lit lanterns that never went out. Some said the sky dimmed for 7 nights. Others swore they heard thunder with no rain. Inside his tent of captivity, Zhu Yuanzhang sat staring at the endless plains. The Mongol Khan offered him tea, asked gently, "Tell me, child of heaven, where's your heaven now?" The emperor had no answer. Back in Beijing, ministers crowned his brother to keep the throne steady. The empire survived, but something within it broke. The certainty that heaven's favor was eternal. Years later, Zhu Yuanzhang was released and returned to his homeland. He rode through the same northern gates his father had once passed, but there were no drums, no banners, no crowds, only silence. The people knelt, but their faces held no joy, only pity. He ruled again in name, but never in spirit. His eyes, once bright with the innocence of a boy king, were shadowed by the endless grasslands of memory. In his later years, he often sat alone in the hall of heavenly purity, listening to the wind move through the corridors. He once told a servant, "When I was young, I thought heaven protected kings. Now I know heaven protects no one, only those who listen to the earth." When he died in 1464, the chronicles recorded his reign simply: triumph in captivity, restoration and regret. Outside the capital, the same wind that once carried Mongol riders moved across the fields again, and if you listened closely, you could almost hear a whisper in that wind, that even empires, like men, must learn to fall before they remember how to stand. The bells of the Forbidden City rang softly at dawn, their echoes fading over the roofs like breath in winter air. In the early years after Zhu Yuanzhang's passing, the empire seemed calm once more. A lake finally stilled after a long storm. His son, the Zhengde emperor, inherited a dynasty weary of war and loss. He was quiet, thoughtful, more scholar than conqueror. He loved poetry, calligraphy, and the art of stillness. But peace, like porcelain, is beautiful only until it cracks. At first, his reign shone with promise. The fields were full again, the granaries heavy with grain. Trade revived, and silver from the seas once more flowed through the markets. For a while, the people believed that heaven's favor had returned. Yet within the walls of the palace, another kind of storm was brewing, a quiet human one. Among his attendants was Lady Wan, a woman far older than the young emperor, once a concubine of his father's household. She had raised him from childhood, and though she was plain and unadorned, she held his heart with the weight of memory. She became his closest companion, his comfort and his cage. As years passed, she tightened her control, banishing other women, silencing ministers, reshaping the palace around her will. The emperor, gentle by nature, found it easier to surrender than to resist. He withdrew from politics, leaving governance to eunuchs and officials, who learned quickly that silence was safer than honesty. Outside the capital, corruption began to creep like vines through old stone. Taxes rose again. Merchants bribed their way to privilege, and in the provinces, peasants once more felt the weight of neglect. But still, life continued. In the markets, the temples, the songs of the tea houses, the empire had not yet fallen. It had simply grown tired. Do you ever notice how endings rarely begin with thunder, but with silence? By the time the Zhengde emperor died in 1487, the light of the dynasty had dimmed, but not gone out. He left behind a son, one who would try, in his quiet way, to make the world right again. That son was the Hongji emperor. When he ascended the throne, he declared a single promise: no deceit in my court. He dismissed corrupt eunuchs, restored order to the treasury, and reopened the academies. He visited granaries in disguise, walked among farmers, and listened to their words without guards between them. The people called him the gentle emperor. Under his rule, officials were chosen by merit rather than flattery. He studied the classics each morning and dined with his empress each evening, the only emperor of the Ming to remain faithfully devoted to one wife. Together, they walked through the palace gardens. At dusk, watching cranes descend over the lotus ponds, she would smile and say, "When the world is quiet, even heaven listens." And he would answer, "Then may heaven always hear us thus." For a brief, golden decade, the empire glowed once more. Its people fed, its borders safe, its ruler kind and unpretentious. But such light, too, was mortal. In 1505, after 22 years of peace, the Hongji emperor fell ill. On his deathbed, he called his ministers close and whispered, "Rule not by fear. Fear is fast, but kindness endures." He died with a calm smile, and across the capital, bells tolled like soft rain. The chronicles would later call his reign the last true harmony of the Ming. After him came rulers less steady, more tempted by excess and neglect. The empire would rise and fall again, as all great things do. But for those who lived under Hongji's rule, they remembered it as a time when even winter felt like spring. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through the ruins of the old palace, it carries the faintest whisper, a woman's laugh, a scholar's sigh, and the voice of a gentle emperor saying, "Peace is the softest sound heaven ever made." Night had fallen over the forbidden city. The golden roofs gleamed faintly beneath the moon, and from the imperial courtyard, the sound of distant drums echoed like a heartbeat fading into the dark. Inside a vast hall of polished jade, a young man sat alone upon the dragon throne. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang, known to history as the Zhengde emperor. He was 14 when he inherited the empire, and far too young to bear the weight of heaven. For a time, his advisors guided him, reciting lessons from the classics, reminding him of the patience and discipline that had made his grandfather, the Hongji emperor, beloved. But the boy's eyes were restless. He listened, nodded politely, and dreamed of everything beyond the palace walls. At night, he would climb the ramparts alone, staring toward the distant lights of the city. "I am the son of heaven," he whispered, "yet I have never seen the world heaven gave me." Do you ever wonder what it feels like to be trapped inside perfection? In the years that followed, the young emperor began to test the boundaries of his world. He built private gardens filled with wild animals, leopards, tigers, and birds from far-off lands. He learned to ride horses faster than his guards could follow. He dressed in the robes of soldiers and merchants, slipping through the gates at night to wander the streets of Beijing under false names. The people whispered of a ruler who hunted tigers by moonlight, who drank with fishermen, and wrestled with soldiers for sport. Some called him bold, others called him mad, but deep inside, he was simply lonely. No one in the palace dared speak to him as an equal. No one ever said no. And so he filled the silence with motion, noise, laughter, danger. The ministers despaired. Memorials piled up unanswered. Corruption spread again through the bureaucracy. While the emperor played at being someone else, the empire drifted without a pilot. In the provinces, floods destroyed fields, bandits roamed the roads, and the treasury began to empty. Yet Zhengde, barely in his 20s, seemed untouched by it all. He rode south in disguise, claiming he was General Zhu, leading mock campaigns that became all too real. He camped with soldiers, ate from wooden bowls, and laughed as they told him crude jokes. To them, he was a comrade, a man who bled and sweated like they did. For the first time, he felt alive. One night, by a campfire near the Grand Canal, he stared into the flames and said softly, "I have seen heaven's order written in books, but it is here in the mud and smoke that I finally understand the world." His companions, not knowing who he truly was, nodded, and for a moment, the emperor smiled like an ordinary man. But empires cannot be ruled by dreams. While he chased freedom, his absence left the court in chaos. Eunuchs grew powerful again, selling offices, manipulating decrees. Famine spread through Hunan. Mongol raiders returned to the frontier, and the ministers, fearful of angering their unpredictable sovereign, did little but wait. In 1519, rebellion erupted in the south. Zhengde rode out once more, not as a ruler, but as the soldier he wished he could have been. Against all warnings, he led his army personally through swamps and storm. Victory came, but at a cost. Disease struck the camp. The emperor fell ill, fever burning through his restless heart. They carried him back to Beijing, half-conscious, muttering of horses, rivers, and skies too wide to measure. He died in the spring of 1521, at just 30 years old. The chronicles recorded simply, he lived without restraint and died without regret. But the people remembered him differently. To some, he was the emperor who turned away from duty. To others, the only one who had tried to taste life beyond the throne. And on quiet nights, when the moon rises over the old city walls, some say they still see a lone rider in golden armor, galloping through the mist, laughing, wild, free, a dragon that could not bear the stillness of heaven, and so chose to chase the horizon instead.